And welcome everyone to today's event, How CIRTL Impacted My Career, Hearing from Teaching Faculty. This is the second event in our three-part series, inviting CIRTL alumni to reflect on how CIRTL has impacted them in seeking and existing in various career paths in and out of academia. And we're so happy to see people join us today for our session on hearing from teaching faculty. I'll hand things over to our host, Rob Linsenmeyer, in just a minute, just to talk a little bit about what to expect in today's event. We will have some prepared Q&A with our panelists, and at the end of our hour, we'll have time for audience Q&A. At any time, feel free to put a question in the chat window so that you don't lose it. And we'll come back to those as soon as we're able, even if you type it in at a moment when someone else is speaking, that's fine. And also think throughout the event today what questions you want to make sure are answered so that when we do get to the Q&A portion at the end of our time, you'll have a question ready to go for our panelists. I'm assuming folks here are familiar with what CIRTL is and who we are, what we do. If you are not, welcome. It's wonderful to have you with us. We are the Center for the Integration of Research, Teaching, and Learning. We're a network of 38 universities in the US and Canada, in very broad terms, working to make the sciences more diverse by changing how they're taught. And today is a wonderful introduction to that work so that we'll actually be able to hear from people who have gone through programming in the CIRTL network to talk about what they got out of it and how it's impacted them in their professional trajectory. So with that long introduction, I will turn things over to our host for the day, Rob Linsenmeyer.
Thanks, Kate. So I'm a professor emeritus at Northwestern University. I've been involved in CIRTL since about 2011. And the impetus for today's session and this whole series of sessions is that we've contacted people who went through CIRTL programs, as many of you are going through them now. And we wanted to hear from them about what CIRTL had to do with their careers so far. And so we're happy to have an alumni network for CIRTL now, and we're able to take advantage of some of the strengths of the people in that network to inform what CIRTL does now and in the future. So Kate, can I have one slide? We have 4 people today, all of whom are in teaching careers in 3 different areas. Elizabeth Becker and Amber Bozer, who are both in the psychology departments at their universities, mainly involved in teaching. Diva Mani, who's in a teaching role in a medical school, which will be a little different. And Chris Richardson, who's an associate professor of astrophysics at another predominantly teaching master's university in North Carolina. So they are, some of them do research, but they also do a lot of teaching. And so we want to hear what those kinds of careers are like. So I think that's all we need from the slide. And I'll start by asking each of them to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what their job is now, what their teaching load is, what other things they do besides teaching, and then also let us know where you did your teaching development work through CIRTL, and anything else you want to add. So let's see, Amber, you want to start?
Absolutely, thank you. So I am at Tarleton State University, which is in rural Texas, about an hour and a half southeast of Dallas. And I've been back here for 8 years now, but I did my CIRTL work at the University of Texas at Arlington from 2010 forward. And my job right now is I am a split appointment. I'm half administration and half faculty. So what that looks like for the 50% faculty role is I teach 2 courses in each long semester and nothing in the summer. And service is wrapped up in that. So that's 40% teaching, 10% service, a service to the university, to the community, and to the profession. The 50% administrative role is I'm the director of faculty and student research on campus. And so I run internal grant programming, train people how to get external grants and things like that. But I just took this role last August. And so I want to tell you what I have primarily been doing since I was here. Prior to that, I was a typical faculty member. And we are considered a teaching institution, although we're an emerging R2. And so that transition will happen here pretty soon. But I was 60% teaching, which was 4 classes in the fall and 4 in the spring. But we have a very large department. And so usually that was a 5-5, and I did some overloads. And then I would teach 4 in the summer, which is something that you can elect to do, or you can take the summer off of teaching. So that was 60% teaching. 30% of it is research. And so I have a EEG lab, a neuroscience lab that's open interdisciplinary to students. And I have undergrad students and thesis students that I train to do neuroscience research. And then 10% service. And for service, I do things like take students to study abroad. I really, really like to travel. And so prior to the pandemic, I was taking students twice a year to South America and to Europe to learn neuroscience. And I volunteer on a lot of committees at the university level. Super type A, so I usually get invited to do that kind of stuff. I also do a lot of work with outreach in our community. I'm actually from the community that I work in. And it, like I said, it's very rural. And so a lot of students aren't aware of neuroscience. A lot of young women and other minorities often don't see themselves going into science. I certainly didn't. And so myself and my grad students get out into the community and do a lot of outreach with students and let them know the opportunities that are available for them in science. And I run the local science fair sometimes. So that's a brief snapshot of what I do. And I think there was one other question on the list. What was it? Oh yeah, okay. So CIRTL was really good for me because I went to a teaching institution for my undergrad and my first master's degree, and I taught as a teaching assistant during that time, and I loved teaching, and the focus was all on teaching. But when I went to get my doctoral degree, at that time, UT Arlington was an emerging R1, and you were explicitly kind of told, don't spend any time on your teaching. You need to be in the lab. You need to live in the lab. And that was an excellent program. And I became a researcher in that program, but I still had a love and passion for teaching. And I've never thought that being a well-rounded scholar was going to happen for me if I just focused on teaching or I just focused on research. I really wanted to have it all. And so CIRTL stood in that gap for me. So while I was at a research institution, I took a lot of the coursework and extramural activities with CIRTL to learn how to teach better as I was being a TA. And ultimately, that professional development and keeping my teaching is what helped me to get a tenure track position at the institution that I'm at now. So that's what CIRTL did for me.
Rob, you're on mute still.
Rob, it looks like you're speaking, but you're on mute, so we're not hearing you.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, I was saying I can't really quite imagine teaching 4 courses a semester, but I guess if you like to do that, that's great. So
yeah, it was hairy in the beginning, but this is my 14th year of teaching. And so I've been, and you know, by that time you start accumulating repeats every semester, classes you've been teaching over a decade. But in the beginning, it was a good thing that I was in my early 20s because I didn't get as tired as I do now. So yeah, it was a heavy teaching load just to get started.
Right. Okay. So we may ask you a little more about the CIRTL specific aspects of this, but let's go on and hear from Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. Elizabeth Becker. It's nice to see all of you. I'm so thrilled that you're here to participate in this event. This is something that I took advantage of when I was in CIRTL, and it was really helpful and informative. And so I hope today is helpful for you. I'm happy to speak about my roles at 2 different institutions. So I've recently transitioned. I'm an associate professor of both psychology and neuroscience. I'm in 2 departments here at Lawrence University in Appleton. And prior to coming here, I was an associate professor and director of behavioral neuroscience at St. Joseph's University. So while Lawrence is a PUI, or a primarily undergraduate institution, St. Joseph's was a master's granting institution. So both institutions were very much, teaching centric, but I would say St. Joe's had a little bit more robust research program. And I think what's interesting, so let me talk about teaching load, because, Amber's story, I was knocked my socks off as well, as Lawrence felt like a really good change for me in terms of balance. And I'm going to talk a lot about balance later, but work-life balance, and balance in terms of how much time do you want to spend doing research and how much time in your teaching, or where did those overlap, excuse me. But at St. Joe's, I had a 2-3 teaching load. And summer was optional, and periodically I taught for adult learners, which was a very powerful experience in the summer. So adults returning to school. And here at Lawrence, I actually have a 2-2-2 teaching load. So we're on the trimester, and that for me has been a really great shift, because that semester where I was teaching 3, I found it was really a grind and hard to be as productive as I wanted to be in the laboratory. And now with 2 as a max, it feels pretty good. And I'm able to focus as much time as I want on my research. I'm a behavioral neuroendocrinologist. I'm a mom. So I've been able to, juggle research, teaching, service, both to institution, organizations, and community with, running to read stories at my children's schools. And I think that's a real strength of institutions like these, is being able to juggle those things. I think for me that, the role of CIRTL, and let me just say that I did that work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So here I am also back where I did my graduate training, and it was invaluable. And I think there were a couple things. At first, when I went through the program, I thought that it really helped me to understand pedagogy. We're all trained to be cutting edge scientists, but it was like, I have no idea how to approach the classroom and how to be effective, let alone how to serve individuals from diverse backgrounds and experiences. And so I think that was helpful. Then I had the lens of, look, there's all these professional development opportunities that showed a habit of interest in teaching, and teaching as research. And I defended in 2010, so I was involved with CIRTL a little bit earlier. I defended my teaching as research project in 2010. That was on my CV, that garnered a lot of interest. So I thought, okay, CIRTL got me a job at that point in my career. And now, after having taught for many years, I see that CIRTL did both of those things, but it really shapes my ongoing perspective as a teacher. That I'm constantly reaching out to resources within the network, friends and teachers, mentors that I met for support, but also those ideas and just that habit formed of thinking about our teaching as research, trying new things, trying to make a difference. CIRTL really set that up for me. One thing I just will mention before we move on, in some of the work that I am able to do, is that I also do a lot of community work but it's in terms of science outreach. And I work with local high school and elementary school students, and I try to integrate them actually into my classes. So not only have we run Brain Awareness Week events or brought community members to campus, but my students are actually engaging with kids at other schools at all of these different levels to try to help break down what neuroscience is, see behind the curtain. And what I've learned from those experiences are that the learning that happens for everyone is so impactful. And I guess I'll leave it there. It's just a really powerful thing that I'd love to talk about if anyone is interested in community collaborations.
Thanks. You've both mentioned doing research, but I think your institutions don't have PhD students. Is that right? We may come back to this point.
We have one PhD program and one EDD program, and neither one of them are run out of my department, and they're both relatively new.
Right.
So where I was at St. Joseph's, they were master's granting. So I always had master students coming through. We had one EDD program as well, and some a graduate business school. Here at Lawrence, it's just PUI, but you have that flexibility to do as much research as you would like.
Okay, Debra, do you want to tell us about your job?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Preferred pronouns, she, her, hers. My name is Diva. I am at the University of Florida. So we do have a medical school, a vet school, a law school, all that stuff. My particular department, the Health and Human Performance Department, is undergrad and grad students. My position, in other words, is a lecturing position. It's 9 months. So I have like a 90-something percentage teaching requirement and like a minor like service requirement. I'm not mandated to do research. So when I came to this university, I came right from my PhD. I spent over 10 years at the University of Colorado. That's where I did my graduate teaching program sorts of stuff. I didn't think I was going to come into academia. I was sure I was going to go into industry. I happened to throw in an application because my advisor, who I'd spent 10 years, undergrad through PhD with, was like, you should do it. It's a great institution. Plus, academia is very ancestral. Your academic uncle is here. You could do research if you wanted to on the side. So I put in an application, and because of CIRTL and other graduate teaching program things, I had a teaching philosophy portfolio ready to go. That is probably the best, most invaluable, tangible thing that I had from this program. So I threw it in, like I put together this application within 24 hours of getting a call that said you should put in an application, got an interview. I went to the village of Gainesville, Florida. If anyone's visited Gainesville, it's very small. We have three gates in the airport. I was like, this is tiny. I can't do this. But I decided to drop the industry interviews and move to Gainesville. So I've been here for 3 years. I too was shocked when I heard Amber's teaching load. And that's because you said it was a 60% teaching position with a usually 5-5 load. And I was like, my teaching load for a 9-month contract is 4-4. Sometimes it's never the 4 same classes, everything from like applied human phys to neuromuscular aspects. I tend to take on more though, just because, once you teach a class once, it's kind of a little more second nature. So I teach for the master's physiology program as well. On the side, I referee national and internationally in judo. So I'm also the faculty advisor for what we call Gator Judo. So that's my like side passion. I loved hearing from Elizabeth about like the K through 12 service involvement. We have very similar things. We have so I'm a neurophysiologist by training. So my professional organizations have programs that I participate in, like National Biomechanics Day, or I get to serve as digital editor for one of ACSM's journals. So there's time and ability to do all these different things. And that's why I've chosen this position. I don't know if I'll stay in academia, but the flexibility is important, because when I am not doing teaching during the regular school year, I get to come back to Colorado where my family and my partner are. So that's my story.
Great, thanks. I didn't really mean to have 3 neuroscientists here. And so for balance, I'm a neuroscientist too, by the way. I work on the retina. But for balance, we have one physicist. So Chris, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Chris Richardson. Pronouns are he and him. And so my job title, as Rob was saying, so I'm an associate professor of astrophysics at Elon University. And so I'm in the physics and engineering department. Teaching, whenever I came in, so a full teaching load for a tenure track faculty is a 3-3. And so we don't have percentages per se, you know, like coded in there for our faculty handbook on what you have for research, teaching, and service. But I think most people would probably agree it's about a 50, 25, 25 split between 50% teaching, 25% service, 25% research, although there's a growing emphasis on research. And like someone else said, it's kind of flexible on how much research you do. It is something that we kind of expect all of our faculty to engage in with students, but the level at which you do that, I mean, you could engage in a whole lot of service and little research, or you could engage in a whole lot of service and whittle back your, or a whole lot of research and then whittle back your service. You could, and then the same goes for teaching as well. So there are ways to apply for internal grants so that you teach less, but you do more research with those grants. If you have external grants, then you can buy out of courses, or if you have significant administrative duties, if you're a dean, director of a program, anything like that, then you teach less than those. So I started out in a 3-3, but I would say over the last 3 years, I've probably averaged a 2-2. And we have a minimum in the university of teaching a 2-1. And so I make up for that teaching by doing research through with students. And I collaborate a lot with UNC. We're about 30 minutes from UNC and 30 minutes from Duke. And so I spend about 1 day a week actually on the campuses working with faculty there and with students. So that's what the course load is like for me. Let's see, what else? Committees. So I was told a long time ago, whenever I first came to Elon, that you should really align your committee work with what you're passionate about and what you're interested in. Learn the value of saying no and not always just saying yes. And so I really enjoy doing research a whole lot. And so essentially all of my committee work has been on research focused initiatives for scholarship programs, student grants, those types of things. And then I also serve on a bookstore committee. And for like 5 or 6 years, I was the faculty advisor for the Society of Physics Students chapter at Elon. So I did my CIRTL program at Michigan State University. I was a FAST fellow there, and I was engaged with the program, I want to say the last 2 years of my time at Michigan State. I graduated in 2013, so I think that would have been 2011, 2012. Yeah, and I can get more into like how CIRTL has benefited me and you know, the Fast Fellow program benefited me, but I mean, I'll just echo all the sentiments that everybody else said. You know, just viewing teaching as sort of through a research lens really helped me out, because, you know, going through your PhD or doctoral programs really teaches you how to be a scientist, but, you know, you can apply that same sort of logic to your teaching. You know, and very few programs teach their perspective, or their new faculty, you know, prospective faculty to actually teach. Yeah, so that the community that was of like-minded individuals at CIRTL across all campus, I found to be really useful. And then developing like this toolbox of assessment and pedagogy and everything else that I could go out and really apply. And whenever I got to Elon, so.
Great, thanks. So let me stick with Chris there for a second. How did you make the decision? Sorry, it's our landline. How did you make the decision to do more teaching and less research? And how did you get enough teaching experience while you were a grad student to be convincing to your current university?
That's a good question. I probably have to ask the search committee about that. I don't actually feel like I got a whole lot of teaching experience. I taught an astronomy lab for 4 semesters early on, but it was I wasn't really in control of that course. It was mostly everything had been developed for me, and I was in there more or less to answer questions and guide students through things. So I kind of felt more or less like a novice, that I'd never really developed a syllabus. I had never developed my own slides. I was told to go through these same slides or the assignments and everything. I mean, I had experience giving them to students and helping them through it, and then tutoring on the side, but there was none of that development. And so I think one thing, and I think a lot of grad students have that same sort of perspective, that they're not given chances to really take a hold of a course themselves and go through it and develop the tests and the quizzes and the assessment questions and do all of that. And it's difficult because you're focusing on research, and to have a faculty advisor that's really open to the idea of you teaching and pursuing that, it can be difficult. And so I think that one thing that set me apart whenever Elon was looking to hire faculty was the fact that I had experience with CIRTL, and I had done a FAST program, and I had a teaching certification. And so even though I didn't develop one for an actual course myself, I went through and learned, like, what's the proper way to develop a syllabus? What's the difference between formal and summative assessments? How do I flip a classroom? How do I do online teaching? Those types of, and so I had the toolbox, and I think, to some degree, I mean, they're taking a chance that you're going to be able to apply all of these things whenever you come in. And I think that certification meant that I was serious, right? I went through all these workshops, we went all through these institutes, and they're like, okay, this is a person that really doesn't just want a job. They want someone who wants to really teach. And I decided on Elon because there's some flexibility. There's a lot of flexibility on how much teaching and how much research you do. So I'm also very passionate about research, and there was a lot of flexibility that sometimes if I wanted to teach more, I could teach more. And if I wanted to do more research, I could do more research. And I appreciated that they allowed you to really come into your own role as a faculty member. And I liked the idea when going up for a tenure track position. I loved research, but I hate writing grants. I'm just not a big fan of writing grants. And I felt like at an R1 institution, my future would be a bit more dictated by external variables, the amount of funding that was available, and writing grants and being able to, score on those for NSF funding and that type of thing. And there wasn't as much flexibility if I wanted to teach a whole lot at an R1. And so I wanted that flexibility. Whereas if I get my classroom, then I'm in control of that classroom and I can do what I want. And hopefully, those students can learn the best of their ability if I'm doing my job. So I felt like my fate was a little bit more in my control, and I had more balance of how I wanted to do things at Elon than I would at a more research focused institution.
Great. So Debra, you didn't even think you were going into teaching role. Did you get much independence as a grad student in terms of teaching?
So aside from 2 years, I had to serve as a teaching assistant. I had a research grant for just 2 of those years as an RA, a research assistant. And because I was there in the same lab for such a long period of time, I became the lead TA, the lead teaching assistant. And that meant that I had to start developing new labs for our neurophysiology lab. And as I started doing this, I was like, oh, well, this is a great opportunity because I'm contributing course material. Let me get this graduate teaching program certificate. So that was the storyline that I gave when I put in my application for this teaching position. I'd already done everything. And even though I went straight from just being a teaching assistant to a full faculty member, like it worked out really well, I suppose.
So far, it seems like it's working. So Elizabeth, did you get to do teaching as a graduate student?
You know what? My story is a bit different. I got a lot. And, you know, there was early in my career, I think there's a lot of that imposter syndrome. And I thought, okay, I'm going to put everything on my CV I possibly can in terms of research and in terms of teaching. And so towards the end, I was able, you know, we TA'd quite a bit. I was able to be instructor of record. And so that was something I kept watching for things to come up. And there was also a professor at a university nearby who suffered a catastrophic stroke. And last minute, I was able to pick up and teach his courses as an adjunct while I was defending. It was maybe not the best timing, but you know, it's putting things on there for people who are thinking, you know, that was luck. There was dumb luck involved, but also, you know, I think I asked people, could I give a guest lecture on that topic? And then I put it on my CV, you know, could I help with something? And I put it on my CV. So I think some of it is, you know, just go after it, even if it's small. These are the things that, you know, everyone else, Chris and Diva has said, are really helping to show that you've gone through the motions and that you have the tools in the toolbox to be successful.
Right, thanks. So I noticed that both Diva and Amber were nodding when Elizabeth mentioned the imposter syndrome that you had early on, and I certainly had that too. And so Amber, what was your teaching experience like at UT Arlington?
Yeah, it actually started at Tarleton when I was a grad student here. I taught intro to psychology while I was working on my master's degree. And we didn't have labs in the department at the time. And so the grad students would teach intro. And so because of that experience, I was able to get a competitive TA line at UT Arlington that was kind of enhanced, where you would teach your own classes or you would teach two sometimes. And sometimes I would have a junior TA that worked with me on some of those courses. And so I taught intro to psych for a few years. And then because a senior faculty member got sick, kind of like what Elizabeth said, he asked me to step in and teach some of his upper level neuroscience and evolutionary psych classes. And so I gained the trust of the faculty, and if you do a good job, you get to do lots of jobs. And so I found myself in a position my last year where I was teaching 4 classes as a TA. And around that time, I became aware that there was a faculty position available back at Tarleton, and they were looking for someone in neuroscience, and they asked me to apply. And so I was able to come in with let me think about how much. So that would have been 6.5 years of teaching experience at that time, teaching my own courses. And so some folks at UTA were like, you can't have a full-time faculty position while you finish your dissertation. And I was like, but I do, because you guys have me teaching 4 classes. So I was able to go ahead and get the external employment and start my first 1.5 years on full-time faculty at Tarleton while I finished up my dissertation. And like Elizabeth said, that was probably a bad idea. It was a rough year. But one of the things that I think has contributed to that is I don't really set boundaries, y'all. I kind of live and breathe this all day, 7 days a week. I think about this, and I'm working, and I did not have any kids until 1.5 years ago. I had a surprise baby my last year on the 10-year track, but I was not planning on doing that. And so my husband is a detective. He's gone a lot. And so I kind of lived this life where I could work anytime I wanted, which turned out to be all the time. And so like I said, I don't really like to say, you know, I'm focused on teaching, I'm focused on research. But like what I've heard before, I always wanted to do research and a lot of research, but I didn't want all the rules with it. Like, you have to do something that's significantly fundable and write all these grants. And I do write grants, but I write it because I enjoy it. And I can pursue research avenues that students are interested in that may not be fundable. And so the research that I do is fun, and I do as much as I want. And so I've walked that back a little bit since I had the baby. And so I don't have to worry about how that will affect post-tenure review or anything. I think our tenure requirements are you need a couple presentations and a couple papers during that tenure window. And I usually do that, you know, every year just by kind of breathing or whatever. So they're really, really relaxed tenure requirements. And so I think in January, I'll start my 14th year of teaching. And unlike Diva, like I said before, I have course repeats. So like I'm half administration now, but I'm teaching 2 behavioral neuroscience classes in the fall. So I've taught those more than a decade, and they're 2 repeats. In the spring, I'll have 2 repeats, you know, and so after you've been doing it for a while, the course loads become more manageable. And if you are in a department situation where you can have repeats, and you may not, but as our department has grown, we've seen that. But one of the things that helped me early in the beginning was they would say, okay, can you teach this and this and this? And can you take on an extra class? And I would say, cool, can you hook me up with someone who has a course shell that will give me their course materials, because that will dictate whether I can do it or not. And I just really tried to avoid doing new preps that were ground up. I just focused on getting materials that were existing and improving them. And improving them through things that I learned in the CIRTL program, actually, because like I said before, they train us really, really well about, you know, stuff in the lab, but nobody really talks to you about teaching that much at the R1 institutions. And so that's been my teaching journey so far.
Great, thanks. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but we should open it up and let the audience ask questions. I always have more if you don't have any. Yeah, so now we have one in the chat. Allison, would you like to say your question, or?
Oh, sure. Can you guys hear me?
Good.
Sure. My question is just thank you all for being here. I really appreciate hearing all about your experiences. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your journey from grad school to your first faculty position. So I'm kind of at that year left of grad school, trying to figure out whether I want to go the research or teaching or some sort of combination of the two. And so I'm wondering if you looked at all at postdoc positions or just straight to a faculty position, and what the thought process behind that was.
So anybody can jump in and answer that.
I'll hop on this one. This is something I'm really passionate about. So, you know, coming from an R1, we were only talked to about going into postdoctoral positions. And a couple people went rogue and went industry, but there really wasn't anybody before me in the program that went into a teaching position. And so I'd heard stories like, oh, if you go to a teaching institution, your research will die, or you'll never do research, and things that I think it's more challenging to do research with a higher teaching load, but you certainly can do it if that's something that you want to do. But there are three things that contributed to my decision not to do a postdoc. One is some of the folks before me were in postdocs for a considerable amount of time and weren't able to land tenure track positions. And so that imposter syndrome got the best of me. I thought, oh, if they can't do it, maybe I can't do it. And, you know, also this tenure track position I had become aware of, and I thought I had a shot of getting it. And the third reason is in one of the labs that I worked in doctoral school, I had a really great mentor who just let me do as much research as I wanted to do. And so I had done probably 35 or 40 experiments or something by the time I left. And I felt like I could set up a lab and I was ready to go. I was his lab manager. I ran the budget, chemical inventory, the rat colony. And so I didn't want to give up the lab manager position and then go work under someone else and potentially have a little bit less say in what was going on. So I'm really type A. I really wanted to get my own lab space and run my own stuff. And so I skipped the postdoc. And now we're hiring more people at our institution that have postdocs, but really most people haven't had that experience. And so I wouldn't say that not having a postdoc has set me apart in any negative way, but doing a postdoc can be really good for you because you can have additional mentorship and learn new kinds of skills and things like that. So it just wasn't right for me, but it could be right for somebody else.
Chris, did you think about doing a postdoc?
Yes, I did. I was offered a postdoc, and I was also offered a couple different teaching positions. And so, and I applied for everything. Like I applied for postdocs, teaching positions, visiting positions, tenure track. And so I think ultimately my case, I think it's a little bit unique, but it might not be. I accepted the position at Elon so I applied for the tenure track position, but they ended up not giving it to anyone, but they turned that into a visiting assistant professor position. And so I knew next year they were going to be looking for a tenure track faculty member again. And so I went ahead, they offered me the visiting position. I went ahead and accepted it because I knew that, maybe I could be on, this inside track, that if I could, show them, that I was passionate about teaching, I could still engage in research and they could work out. And then it happened to do that. And so, and then I declined the postdoc for that. So, I mean, I think the question was, what's your advice looking at different positions to apply for? I would be really, really hesitant to apply right out of grad school well, you can apply for them, but if you're given numerous options to take any sort of visiting positions, especially if they're only a year, because by the time you get there, within a couple months, you're going to be right back on the job market. And so you're not going to have enough time to really, keep your research going. You're going to be teaching maybe a 4.4 or a 3.3, and it's going to be really tough to do that. I was offered only one prep my entire first year at Elon, which is pretty rare. So I just taught the same class 6 times. And so I knew that I could be able to get some research done. And even then it was tough. Like I was like, wow, this is only one class and it's flooring me. And so, unless you've got a couple years to develop in there, I would try to avoid those positions, or unless if you're interviewing for them, ask about the nature of the position, because it might be that a professor is retiring, in which case then they might be looking for a full-time faculty member later, a permanent one. So, but then sometimes the visiting position will be there to cover someone who's on sabbatical, in which case they wouldn't be. So that's the one thing I'd be careful of. Looking back, I think that it probably, if I wasn't in my unique circumstance, I would have done a postdoc before going into a teaching position, even though I think I ultimately wanted to be in a teaching focused institution, I still would have done the postdoc because it would have given me more time to develop a network, a professional network for research that I can engage with my students. I think I did miss out on that component. And basically every faculty hire that I know in the science building, in our department and outside that has come after me, every single one of them has done a postdoc. And so I do think that, and I've been on search committees, and it is a discussion that we wonder, are they showing this research independence where they can involve students in, a research program, and maybe even bring in funding. Even though we're a teaching focused institution, those discussions are still there. It's a lot harder to go to a teaching position and then go back to a postdoc than it is to do a postdoc and then go to a teaching position. So if you're ever kind of like weighing between the two, I would do the postdoc, try to get more teaching experience, maybe in your postdoc by subbing in classes, doing certification and that type of stuff, and then try and proceed towards, more teaching focused pathway.
Yeah, we have 2 more questions in the chat. Anne will be next, and then Angela. But let me just say, if you're in the biological sciences, there are these great NIH postdocs that intentionally are partly researching, partly teaching, ERACTAs, and quite a few universities have those, and they allow you really to develop both and actually get a good teaching experience. Anne?
Hi, yes, thanks so much. It was really interesting. I was so eager to hear about each of your experiences, and they're very inspiring experiences. I just wanted to ask you, I assume some of the people listening, and certainly CIRTL is especially focused on those who are graduate students. When you think back in your careers, where you are now, and also your grad experience, what advice do you have for those who are either really wanting to have teaching in their careers? What advice might you have during the grad experience to doctoral experience to cultivate that? And also, for those that are just not quite sure, what experiences would you want to urge people to cultivate during the doctoral experience? Recognizing, of course, that there's a great deal of pressure to be cultivating oneself as a researcher when you're a doctoral student. How to navigate that graduate experience is the question, really. And any of you, I'd love to hear your thoughts, whoever wanted to speak up.
I can say something. I mean, I think it is difficult. I mean, to be focused on, so much research and, trying to get papers out and being involved in grant writing and that type of thing. If there's anybody that's still looking for their PhD advisor, I mean, I know a lot of times, you do 2 years, you might do like a master's, and then, you can go on, and sometimes people switch advisors. It's worth having a discussion with your faculty, potential faculty advisors about, what do you think about, teaching? And, do you see, like this sort of balance? Are you 100% research? Are you supportive of grad students that might not want to go the R1 route? Because my first PhD advisor, who I thought was going to be my PhD advisor, I told him I wanted to go to a institution that is focused on teaching, but I still wanted to do a bit of research. And he looked at me and he's like, "What are you talking about? Like, what are these types of universities?" And I gave him a few, and he's like, "I've never heard of them." And I said, well, I mean, I came from one of them. My undergrad was like this. And he goes, well, I mean, if you're focused on teaching, then I mean, you could just stop with your master's and teach at a community college. And I thought to myself, I'm like, okay, I know that this is not so bimodal. I know that it's not this and then research, right? And he literally had no clue that these existed. And so the idea of sitting in on his classes or taking over one day when he was traveling to teach a class or anything like that was just, it was completely out of his ballpark. And then went to another professor who knew everything about that. And that was my only decision to switch, but it really did help. And so, even if you're in your early stages as a graduate student, I think those are the types of discussions that need to be having with a potential mentor. And then in terms of if you've already selected your mentor and you're a couple years from graduating, I mean, getting as many CIRTL-like opportunities, I think, is the best way to do it. You're not always going to have the chance to teach a class, take in control of everything, but just learning about the modern ways of viewing teaching through pedagogy and assessment and everything else that we've been talking about, and forming a community and a network of people, not just at your school, but abroad. There's lots of institutes that might be offered by your disciplinary conferences that you go to, and teaching like introductory courses or upper level courses, and having all of those on your CV and prominently showing them. I think all of it's really helpful.
Just quickly, yes or no question, Chris. Did you do a teaching as research project?
Yes.
Yes. And I think Elizabeth said she did. And Diva did, and Amber did. Yeah. Okay. So that's 4 for 4. So I think that's part of the answer to Anne's question. That something that is pretty much uniquely CIRTL, that really stands out. Does anybody else want to tackle Anne's question about what you?
I would just say do what you love, and in the position that you're able to get, make it work, right? And people may say, well, that's weird, or that's not the way I want you to do it. But if you love it and you have passion for it, you can make it work. I'll give you one example. So I was trained to do research with rats, right? So I was implanting electrodes down into their brains and seeing what was going on and recording local field potential. But at the institution that I got hired at, we did not have a rat lab at that time. And there were a lot of folks doing research with humans, and I had a limited budget. And so what I decided to do was open an EEG lab, which is somewhat analogous to local field potential recording. And so in one of the first semesters that I was here, when I was going to teach the graduate physiology seminar, I had that seminar have a focus on EEG so that I could justify spending some time in that. And because the students' applied learning experiences would also be using EEG. And so there are ways that you can marry teaching and research if you find yourself in that situation, to still provide great learning opportunities for students, but make sure that you don't like die early, because you just can't do everything, you know? So yeah, you'll make it work and do what you love.
Thanks so much.
That was very clever, Amber.
Very nice.
Yeah, Elizabeth.
Rob, I was just going to follow up. Amber made me think of something in terms of, you know, the do what you love. I think when you're preparing, it's also important. We've spent a lot of time thinking about teaching, but important to think about how do you pitch your research, if you still love research, for these types of institutions, right? PUIs, liberal arts institutions. You know, if you say I'm doing fMRI, they're going to say, no, you're not, right? But so be thinking now, what lines can you bring with you that are affordable and reasonable? And as Amber suggested, you know, can you pivot a little bit? So there's opportunity to be creative, but just know that research is still valued at these institutions. There is money for it. And especially if you, as Amber suggested, think about how do you integrate your research into your teaching, there could be a good amount of money for it.
Yeah. Thank you all for those comments.
We should go to Angela's question, which I think is an interesting one. Angela, do you want to speak up?
Hi there. Yes, I just curious as to how you balanced with COVID, how you balanced your in-person teaching with online teaching, and just kind of what was the differences or difficulties you had with that?
Might be another 2-hour discussion, but give it a shot, folks.
My first thought when I saw your question, Angela, was I actually loved it. And that's because I don't have the same responsibilities, I think, as like maybe Amber and Elizabeth. I have a baby niece that was recently born, and that's really a struggle. But I love being able to teach remotely. And I love HighFlex, where I literally go into a classroom in person last spring and I teach in person, but then there are TV screens where I'm doing Zoom at the same time. And the reason I appreciate it is because of the accessibility. I don't necessarily need the students to be on their camera to be able to engage with them. And I think maybe part of the reason I'm biased towards liking this so much is my personality. I kind of get in their faces and I make jokes, and I use activities like Flipgrid to make sure it's an engaging experience, especially in the non-asynchronous classes like my master's students. But I suppose I put myself in their shoes, and that's how I managed it and made it so fun. If I have trouble with getting on a Zoom with camera because I'm holding the baby niece while her mom, a physician's at work, these other students are probably experiencing something similar. So I'm not going to require that they do video. I can get them engaged in some other way. So I really liked it, actually, and I'm probably one of 100.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Oh, sure. I was also going to say, Diva, you're not alone. I really enjoyed it. I think for me, once in a while, you could Google something, you know, when you didn't know the answer. Let me find that for you. Ta-da! And you look amazing. But the reality is I had an opportunity to teach online prior to the pandemic for these adult learners. And I learned and reached out to folks in CIRTL about online pedagogy. I think so many of us took our first classes online or had that opportunity. And that's where I really understood, hey, this is a powerful tool. So for me, it was not thinking about it as pandemic teaching, but really what unique things could we do with technology? And, those breakout rooms, they were fantastic. So there was a lot of other things, shared whiteboards that I really did enjoy, but certainly had borrowed from my CIRTL days.
Thanks. So we we have a question from Joanne, which is an interesting question because teaching might not be what everybody wants to do full time. Joanne, do you want to ask that question?
Sure. Thanks, Rob, and hi, everyone. So Amber, you described about having both the faculty and admin role. And I'm just wondering, I'm sure others have admin responsibilities as well. If you feel that your CIRTL training prepared you for that split, and if you were able to leverage that training in any way to actually gain that split position and have more of an administrative role or running programs or grants like that.
Hey, Joanne, thank you for your question. Actually, yes, and I'll explain to you how. So I love research, I'm super active in research, and so I found out they were going to need a temporary director of research for about a year until our new VP of research came and created a new division of research. And so I had that opportunity when they developed a Center for Educational Excellence, which houses a teaching pillar, a research pillar, a service pillar, and a study abroad pillar. And so I came in really hard in the interview phase with, look at all this stuff I did with CIRTL, their research, teaching, learning. And this center is being made kind of in the spirit of that model, looking at well-rounded scholars. And recently, again, knowing that I'll be moving out of this role in the next year, instead of going back to faculty, I proposed that I maintain a director of position and take on a director of professional development position in the Center for Educational Excellence that would be doing programs like CIRTL, which is what we call TAR, and a couple other things. And again, I came in with the CIRTL training because a lot of people don't have the opportunity to get the kind of training that CIRTL provides. And so, yes, it came up a lot in the interview phase both times in the last fiscal year. And I've been really blessed to have it.
So Elizabeth, I think you also been a director of research.
I was the director of the behavioral neuroscience program, but very fortunate, like Amber, to be able to use CIRTL background and expertise to get involved with the teaching center. So I was a founding member of our Office for Teaching and Learning on campus at St. Joseph's University. Modeled right after CIRTL.
That's good to hear. We are pretty close to being out of time. Let me see if Kate wants to say a couple of words here.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to all of our panelists and our participants today for today's discussion. As someone who works for CIRTL, it feels like selfishly gluttonous to just hear people talk about the wonderful experiences they've gotten through participating in our programming. So this has been a delight for me. I did put a link in the chat window, and you should all have it in your inboxes as well for a quick post-event exit survey. Just, was this good? Essentially, because we are educators and educational researchers, we can't do anything without a survey. So your feedback is anonymous and incredibly helpful to us. And we do have one more event in this series next week, next Thursday. We'll be hearing from alumni who have pursued careers outside of academia. So if that's something you're considering, curious learning about, we hope to see you again this time, same place, next Thursday.
Yeah, those of us who have been involved in CIRTL are really actually curious about this, how CIRTL backgrounds can be used to leverage careers outside of academia. I guess Diva was planning to do that at one point. But these are people who've actually done it. So I also want to thank the panelists. great deal for their insights and the audience for coming and spending an hour with us and asking questions. So I think with that, we'll say goodbye until next week. Thanks, everybody.